The night Sloane Mercer decided to stop running, she was sitting on the bathroom floor of a basement unit in Verdun, with a needle in one hand and $14 in her coat pocket. She hadn't planned it that way. She hadn't planned much of anything in the past 3 years, but the pipe under the sink had burst sometime around 2 in the morning, and the water was cold, and her landlord wasn't answering, and somewhere between mopping up the flood with dish towels and realizing she'd cut her palm on a broken tile, she'd just stopped, sat down, pressed her back against the cabinet under the sink, and let the water soak through her jeans. Outside, Montreal was doing what Montreal did in November: sleet against the windows, the kind of wet cold that went straight through walls. She looked at the cut on her palm. It wasn't deep, but it was messy, and she'd run out of bandages 2 weeks ago. She found a sewing kit in the back of the medicine cabinet, a tiny plastic thing from some hotel she'd stayed in years ago, in another life, and she sat there under the broken pipe and thought, "This is fine. This is manageable. I have handled worse than this." She had. That was the thing nobody understood about Sloane Mercer. She had handled considerably worse than this. She'd been working for Callaway and Associates for 11 months. She knew, going in, that Callaway and Associates was not what its website claimed. The website said financial consulting and asset management. And technically that was accurate, the way a gun is technically a tool. She'd known from the first interview, sitting across from a man named Finch, who never quite met her eyes, and asked questions about her tolerance for irregular hours and her opinion on discretion. She needed the job. She took it. What she hadn't known, what she'd figured out slowly, the way you figure out a room's layout in the dark by running your fingers along the walls, was how deep it went. The accounts she reconciled weren't just complex. They were engineered, layered, built by someone who understood that money, like water, always found the lowest point, and you had to redirect the flow before anyone noticed the flood. Whoever had designed the system was exceptional. She'd never seen anything like it. She'd also never met the man who owned it. Reyes was a name people said quietly in that office. Not out of reverence, exactly. More like the way you'd name a weather system. Reyes the way you'd say storm coming. Reyes the way you'd check the sky and decide whether to cancel your plans. He didn't come into the office. His instructions arrived through Finch, and Finch arrived through a closed door, and the closed door led to a boardroom Sloane had never been inside. She reconciled numbers that went nowhere on paper and everywhere in practice. She kept her head down. She did not ask questions. She was, by any measure, excellent at her job. The problem, and there was always a problem, was the error she'd found in October. Not her error, someone else's. A transposition, small enough to miss if you went looking for it, catastrophic enough to unravel 3 layers of structure if it went unaddressed. She'd flagged it to Finch. Finch had gone pale in a way she found unsettling. Finch had said he'd handle it. He hadn't handled it. 6 weeks later, sitting on her bathroom floor with a cut palm and $14 to her name, she was still waiting. She didn't hear the car pull up outside. She didn't hear the door. Her door, the one she was certain she'd locked, open and close with the kind of quiet that only comes from practice. She did hear footsteps in the hallway, and she went still. Footsteps at 2 a.m. in Verdun were never good news. She reached for the counter above her, found nothing useful, and settled for staying very still and very quiet, and hoping whoever it was would conclude there was nothing worth their time in a water-damaged basement unit. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. A knock. 2. Controlled. Miss Mercer. Not a question. She stared at the door for a long moment. The voice was low, accented faintly in a way she couldn't immediately place. Not Quebecois, not Anglo-Montreal. Something older. "Mrs. Mercer, I can see the light under the door." She closed her eyes briefly. Then she said, "The door's not locked." It opened. The man who stepped into her bathroom doorway was not what she'd built in her head from 11 months of second-hand information. She'd imagined something louder, something that announced itself. What she got was a man in a dark coat that probably cost more than her annual rent, standing in the doorframe of her flooded bathroom, looking at her on the floor with an expression she couldn't read. He was older than she'd expected. Mid-40s, maybe. dark hair with grey at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for so long it had forgotten how to unclench. There were lines around his eyes that weren't from laughing. A scar along his left jaw she could see even in the bad light. He looked at her. He looked at the needle in her hand. He looked at the water still spreading slowly across the tile. "That's a sewing needle," he said, very observant. "And that's a cut on your hand." Also accurate. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. She'd spent 11 months reading numbers in that office, and she still couldn't have named what it was. "Why?" he said. "Are you on the floor?" The pipe burst. She nodded toward the cabinet above her head. "I was cleaning it up." I sat down. The floor was wet anyway. She paused. "Why are you in my apartment?" "I have a key. You have a key to my apartment. Finch keeps copies of all employee residences, liability purposes." He said this without any discernible irony. "I came to discuss the October file." Sloane looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the needle down on the edge of the tub, carefully, because she was not going to be reckless about this, just because she was rattled, and pressed her good hand against the cabinet to push herself up. She made it about halfway before the room tilted. She didn't fall. She caught the towel rack, which protested loudly but held. When her vision cleared, Reyes was one step closer than he'd been, one hand half raised, and he had the particular expression of a man who had decided to do something and was only now questioning whether it was the right call. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't look fine." "That's a recurring theme." She straightened carefully. The cut on her palm was bleeding again. She could feel it, and the fluorescent light above was doing something unpleasant to her peripheral vision. "You said you wanted to discuss the October file." "I said I came to discuss it. I didn't say we were going to stand in your flooded bathroom at 2 in the morning to do it. This is my apartment. I don't really have another option for the bathroom." He looked at the standing water. He looked at her. He looked at the sewing needle she'd set on the tub. "Get your coat," he said. She got her coat. She also got her laptop bag, because she had the October file on a drive in the front pocket, and she was not leaving it in a flooded apartment. She told him this while she was pulling on her coat, matter of fact, and he said nothing, which she chose to interpret as acceptance. The car outside was black and unremarkable, which told her more than a flashy one would have. The driver didn't turn around. Reyes opened the back door and she got in, because her alternatives at 2 a.m. in November were limited, and she was bleeding through her sleeve. He got in on the other side. The car started moving. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My office. At 2 in the morning. The October file isn't a 9 to 5 problem." She looked out the window. The streets were wet and nearly empty, the sleet turning to proper snow now, the kind that stuck to glass and made halos around the streetlights. She had the strange, dissociated feeling of watching herself from somewhere outside her body. The flooded bathroom, the sewing needle, the car, and now this quiet man beside her who had apparently decided her life was part of his operational portfolio. "I flagged that error in October," she said. "I know. I told Finch it needed to be addressed within 2 weeks, or the Q4 reconciliation would show a variance that couldn't be papered over. I know. Finch didn't address it." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past the windows, the bridge, the river, the lights of Westmount climbing the hill. "Finch," he said finally, "is no longer with the company." She absorbed this. Since when? Since this evening. She thought about Finch. The pale face, the closed door, the way he'd said, "I'll handle it," with the conviction of a man who absolutely would not handle it. "What does that mean for the Q4 reconciliation?" she asked. Something shifted in Reyes's expression. It wasn't quite surprise. It was closer to the look she sometimes saw on people's faces when they expected a dog to flinch, and it didn't. "That," he said, "is what we're going to discuss." His office was not what she expected either. She'd expected something that performed power, glass and chrome, and the particular sterility of spaces designed to intimidate. What she got was a townhouse in Outremont that had been converted without losing the feeling of being a house. Warm light, dark wood bookshelves that looked genuinely red. The kind of place that said, "I have nothing to prove." or the kind of place that had moved so far past, proving things it had circled back around to comfort. There was a man at the front door who didn't introduce himself and didn't look at her directly. There was another at the top of the stairs. She counted 3 more on the way to the office, and she was fairly certain there were others she hadn't counted. The office itself had a fireplace going, which she hadn't expected. November in Montreal, but still, a fire. Reyes took off his coat. He was broader without it, which she registered the way she registered anything, as information filed away, not acted upon. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a chair by the fire. "I'm fine standing. You're bleeding on my floor." She looked down. The cut on her palm had soaked through the dish towel she'd wrapped around it sometime in the car. There was, in fact, a small dark stain on the hardwood. "Sorry," she said, which was automatic, and she hated it even as she said it. He was already moving. A cabinet, a drawer, a first aid kit that looked like it had been used. He set it on the edge of the desk and looked at her. "Sit," he said again. She sat. Not because he'd told her to, because the room was warm and she'd been cold for so long the heat was making her realize how close she was to the edge of what she could manage. He sat across from her, not at the desk but in the other chair by the fire, and he opened the first aid kit with the efficiency of someone who'd done this more times than most people do in a hospital visit. "Give me your hand," he said. She did not immediately give him her hand. "You came to discuss the October file," she said. "We'll get to it. It's a time-sensitive matter." Mercer, he looked up at her and there was something in his face that she couldn't quite categorize. Not impatience, not irritation. Something flatter and more tired than either. "The Q4 filing doesn't close for 9 days. Your hand is bleeding now, let me see it." She held out her hand. His hands were careful. She hadn't expected careful. She'd expected efficient, maybe. She'd already clocked him as someone who valued efficiency over almost everything, but careful was different. He cleaned the cut without flinching at the mess of it, without comment, without any of the performative wincing people sometimes did when you showed them a wound, as if they wanted credit for witnessing it. "This needs a proper closure strip," he said. "I know. I was going to use the needle. I know what you were going to use. It would have worked." He applied the closure strip with the same economy of movement he seemed to bring to everything. "But this is cleaner." "The pipe burst," she said, which was not what she meant to say. "You mentioned. It wasn't a crisis. The pipe burst and I was cleaning it up and I sat down for a minute and I just—" She stopped. She didn't finish sentences that way. She finished sentences, "I was going to handle it. I know." There was no pity in his voice. That was what made her look at him. He was looking at the bandage he was finishing, not at her. His face was closed, the way she'd learned closed could look from the inside. Not blank, but contained. She knew this face. She wore this face. "The error," she said, "is in the Beaumont account. Whoever built that structure transposed the routing numbers for 2 of the holding entities in 22. It's been compounding for 14 months. It's not visible on the surface reports, but it's going to show up in the year-end audit as a $17,000 variance, and if someone pulls the thread goes a long way." He looked up at her then. 17, he said. $17,412. I have the exact figure on the drive. She nodded toward her bag. I also have a proposed correction pathway that closes the variance without triggering a review flag. It's a 3-step reroute. It takes about 4 hours to execute if you have authority over the Beaumont accounts, which I assume you do. He was quiet for long enough that she started to question whether she'd misjudged the room. "You built a correction pathway," he said, "in October, when I flagged it to Finch. I assumed he'd want the solution and the problem. He didn't mention it." "No," she said. "He didn't." Something moved through Reyes's expression. She thought it might have been anger, but it sat too still for anger. Anger moved. This was something that had learned to stay very, very still. "Show me," he said. She pulled up the drive on her laptop and walked him through it. She'd expected interruptions. She'd expected the particular kind of mansplaining that came with power. The "yes, but have you considered?" and the "I think what you mean is." She'd sat across from enough boardroom tables, to recognize the way some men listen to women presenting numbers, the barely there delay between what you said and the moment they decided to trust it. Reyes didn't do that. He listened the way she'd always wanted to be listened to. Like what she was saying was the most important thing in the room, and like he had no need to perform understanding because he simply actually understood. He asked 3 questions. All 3 were the right questions. The third reroute, he said. You've accounted for the Sécurité Financière reporting threshold, below it. Intentionally. And the timing on the second step. Why the 48-hour gap? System flag avoidance. There's an automated review trigger if 2 account transfers happen within 24 hours above a certain threshold. I split them across business days. You've done this before. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Not for a syndicate, she said, but the math is the same. He looked at her. Where did you work before this? A bank, she said. And before that, a different kind of bank. How old are you? 29. And Finch found you where? I found Finch, she said. I knew what the job was. I needed the job. She held his gaze. That's not something I'm ashamed of. He didn't look like he expected her to be ashamed. He looked like he was doing the same thing she'd done with him in the car, filing information away, recalibrating, building a more accurate picture. The correction pathway you built, he said, it'll work. Yes, and you didn't go to Finch with the solution because you wanted to solve the problem. You went because you needed someone with account authority. Yes, and when he didn't act on it, I waited, she said. I've been waiting 6 weeks. She paused. I was going to give it until the end of the month, and then I was going to... She stopped. What? She looked at the fire. I hadn't fully decided yet. You were going to leave, he said. She didn't answer, which was an answer. He leaned back in his chair. It was the first time she'd seen him do anything that wasn't precise, and she read the gesture as deliberate, a choice to take up a different kind of space in the room. The people who built the Beaumont structure, he said carefully, are not people who tolerate loose ends. I'm aware. You've been sitting on this for 6 weeks. I've been sitting on a drive with the correction pathway on it, she said. That's different from a loose end. A loose end is a liability. This is a solution, for someone with account authority. Yes, he was quiet. The fire cracked. As outside the windows the snow had committed, she could see it piling on the stone sill, white and purposeful. If I give you access to the Beaumont accounts, he said, you could execute the correction pathway yourself. Yes, and there would be no trace of the original error. No trace of it in the system. Whether you've told anyone about it is your own matter. He almost smiled. She saw it. A fraction of movement, there and gone. You understand what it means, he said. If I give you that access, it means you trust me. It means considerably more than that. She understood. If she had access to those accounts, she had information. Information had weight. Weight could be used. She looked at him directly. Then don't give it to me, she said. Give me supervised access. I'll execute the corrections in front of your people. Screen recorded if you want. I don't need you to trust me. I need you to let me fix the problem I found. He studied her for a long moment. Why? He said. What do you want from this? She thought about the bathroom floor, the $14, the pipe still dripping somewhere in her apartment. To do the job, she said. Properly. Without Finch in the middle of it, and if I offered you Finch's role. The silence lasted exactly as long as she let it last. I'd want to see the full account structure first, she said, not the surface reports, the actual architecture. Another fraction of a smile. Smaller than the first. Of course you would, he said. They worked until 5 in the morning. She hadn't planned that either. She'd planned to walk him through the correction pathway, get authorization, and leave. What happened instead was that they got into the mechanics of it, and she started pulling threads. And he started asking questions, and somewhere around 3:30, she'd filled 4 pages of his notepad with structural diagrams, and he hadn't told her to stop. He brought her tea at some point. She didn't ask for it. It appeared on the desk beside her laptop, and she drank it without looking up from the screen, and she noticed peripherally that he drank the same thing. When the third step of the correction was complete and the verification report showed clean, she leaned back in the chair, his desk chair. She'd migrated there at some point without quite deciding to, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Done. It was done. The error was corrected. The variance was closed. The thread had been tucked back into the fabric of the structure, and no one pulling at Beaumont from the outside would find the place where it had come loose. "It's clean," she said. Reyes was standing at the window. He'd been there for the last hour, not watching her work, or not only watching her work, watching the street below, the steady professional watchfulness of someone who never fully turned their back on exits. "Yes," he said. "The year-end audit will show nothing. I know." She looked at the screen. She looked at her hands, the bandaged one, the other one, both of them steady. She was tired in a way that went all the way down to some foundational layer of herself, and the fire was lower now but still going, and the snow outside was several inches deep on the sill. "I want to see the full architecture," she said. She'd said it in that office before. He'd almost smiled at it. She said it again now, because she meant it now the same way she'd meant it then, and because she was someone who finished what she started. He turned from the window. He looked at her in the low firelight of 5 in the morning with the expression she'd been trying to read since he'd appeared in her bathroom doorway, and she still couldn't name it exactly. It was tired. It was careful. It was the look of a man who had not, in a long time, encountered something he didn't immediately know what to do with. "Tomorrow," he said. "Come back tomorrow." "Technically. Today," he corrected. "After you've slept. The pipe in my apartment is still broken." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are rooms here." She looked at him. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. She was going to say no. She had a system for this, a careful calibrated architecture of her own, all the distances she kept, and the exits she mapped, and the doors she made sure she could get to. She'd built it piece by piece over 3 years of understanding exactly what kind of people lived in this world, and what they took from people who let them close. "Second floor," he said. "East wing. There's a lock on the door." The way he said it. Not "you're safe here," not a promise she hadn't asked for. Just a lock on the door. Information. Her choice. She picked up her laptop bag. "I'll want the full architecture by 8, she said. 8 is 4 hours from now. I work fast." She walked to the door. She stopped, because she thought she should say something, and because she wasn't sure what. "The Beaumont error," she said without turning around. "It wasn't from your design. The structure you built, the core of it, that's clean. Whoever transposed those routing numbers did it in 22, after the original architecture was established. It's not your mistake." She didn't know why she said it. She'd spent 11 months not saying things she didn't have to say. "I know," he said. "I know," she said. "But I thought you should hear it from someone who'd read the whole thing." She went upstairs. She found the east wing. There was, as he'd said, a lock on the door, and she turned it, and she sat on the edge of a bed in a room she hadn't planned to be in, and looked at the ceiling. Outside, Montreal was very quiet under all that snow. She thought about the bathroom floor. She thought about the needle. She thought about Finch saying, "I'll handle it," with all the confidence of a man who understood neither the error nor the stakes. She thought about Reyes asking 3 questions, all of them the right ones. She thought about what it meant to be trusted with something that could unravel everything, and to have that trust offered, not because someone was naive about what you could do with it, but because they were not naive at all. She lay back on the bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but for the first time in 3 years, she didn't check the exits.